I'm Jim Gorney. It's a pleasure and privilege to introduce Françoise Davoine. She's been my dear friend and colleague for over 40 years. For decades, she's been a loyal and very consequential member of this group in ISPS International. Along with her late husband, Jean-Max Gaudier, she's worked in the trenches, brilliantly adapting psychoanalytic psychotherapy for the treatment of trauma and madness. Françoise is tough. She can fight persistently to forge connection with individuals inhabiting extreme states. Her clinical and theoretical writings make a most significant contribution to the subjective comprehension of an interpersonal engagement with psychosis. Françoise has creatively applied principles of war psychiatry to the battle zone which emerges when encountering and confronting extreme states. In her contribution today, she applies these same principles of war psychiatry to the traumatic combat zone of the current COVID crisis. She will highlight vividly the ways in which both love and justice are being manifested by those frontline medical workers who bravely engage in battle as they fight the war against the virus. As always, Françoise will now speak the truth, leading the charge as we all face the horror of pandemic war.
In the extreme states of the pandemic, love and justice are engaged by those who work on the front lines where death is at stake. Since I gave my proposal for this conference, in which I focused on critical moments when the analyst story is triggered in the transference to reach an exiled subject reified by defective diagnosis, people were dying at home and in the crowded hospitals. Last April, confinement was ordered in France, and since then, I talk, because I am old and so on, to my patients on the phone. Paradoxically, those who had been labeled psychotic use the resources which had been acknowledged during our work. Solitude, death threats, about which others complain, were normal to them, so they became active. I give you 4 examples of patients with whom I have worked during quite a while. Exploring with them, the rupture of the social link like we have now in their history and the bigger history, and also in mine. A lady who had been labeled schizophrenic and spent a lot of time in hospitals started to write 150 pages during the confinement. Then she bought a computer, learned to use it, and now plans to send her pages to a publisher. A second one, with the same diagnosis, decided to type the journal of her grandfather during First World War, and she realizes he was 21 in the trenches. A painter who is labeled maniaco-depressive in French, manic depressive, who had stopped painting for quite a while, started to do etchings on people who had been in a concentration camp near his house, near his house in the south of France, which is now a golf course. The fourth is a so-called autistic girl who stopped school around 12. She started to learn again. And now she's in a place where she can learn, and she found a boyfriend there. She had been raped when she was 6 at Christmas by the friend of the family and never spoke about it. So this is very paradoxical. I will not expose the interferences which occurred in each story with my own story. Let me just call these outcomes the birth of a political subject, giving voice to erase the arrears in our time. In the meanwhile, I also found myself in a totally other mindset. Our president had made a speech ordering the confinement in April and repeating, "We are at war." But there was no bombing like I saw when I was a kid, a baby. No blood in the streets. Still, time had stopped. The future was completely uncertain, and the past life was impossible to return or to continue. So a French historian in our school of research, where I am now retired, Stéphane Rousseau, historian of First World War, said, "We are not at war, but we are in a war time." He's the one who greeted our seminar after Jean-Marc's death when I stopped it. And this wartime is a time that we share when we deal with the transference in extreme states. In April, I received a mail from Barbara Cooperman, the daughter of Martin Cooperman, psychoanalyst at Austin Briggs, whom we knew and respected very much. The mail was sent me testimony. It was a testimony of an emergency doctor in New York, and I was struck. I was very impressed by this testimony. So very often forgotten and also condemned by a lot of discourses, even by mainstream analysis, psychoanalysis. So I realized also that I had a very personal reason which urged me to talk to them. My grandfather had been one of them. He was a stretcher bearer on many fronts of the First World War. I loved him. He died, I was 10, but he never talked about it. He just sung to me or whistled. And myself, I had an experience of Frontline Doctor. When I was a toddler, at the beginning of 1945, I had been cured by such a Frontline Doctor. I knew just a little bit of the story, but it was revealed to me in 2017, just before my father's death. This is the story. I was a toddler, and there was a meeting of the resistance leader in our kitchen in the Alps. And I put my both hands on the blazing stove, which was not insulated at that time. So I make it short, the story. There was a doctor, a young man, who took me on his laps. And my father said, I did not know, "You immediately stopped screaming and looked at him all the while when he bandaged your hands. He is my first psychotherapist." So I asked my father, what was his name? He said, "I don't know." I tried to pay him, he refused. He probably was shot very soon after. So this story pushed me to contact healers like him. I talked about the testimony of the emergency doctor in New York to my son, Brice Godillère, who is an anesthesiologist in Stanford and also who has a lab on immunology. Immediately, he connected me. He was struck, there is some transmission there. He connected me with a French colleague who had just left the lab to return to his hospital in Paris, also researcher and anesthesiologist, Frank Verdon. This young man connected me and we started video by Zoom, like this one, with 3 anesthesiologists, well, he and 2 young women, 2 nurses, and from another source with an emergency doctor among the firemen, a young woman who works in the east of Paris and the suburbs where there are a lot of immigrants. I was stunned. In a world of machines with, well, at that time, scarce resources and patients in artificial comas, they displayed in their speech to me the Salmon Principles of forward psychotherapy. Speaking of transference, they say, I made a transference, although they didn't know, they had no clue about psychoanalysis. So here are the principles. Proximity, first, proximity. Fear was the first word that they shared with the patient and the families. One anesthesiologist had repeated nightmares that she was intubated herself. And one of the nurses said, we choke with them. But the second word was very surprising, joy. When they succeeded after several weeks to wean them from the machine, 1 step forward, 2 steps backward, and sometimes going all over again so that they can breathe by themselves. And the joy was shared by the whole team. Long after, they say, they remember the faces and the names of the patients, who, in the meanwhile, were also identified by numbers on the screen. As they performed routine care, always the same, because there is no medicine, no treatment. Oh, for all of them, breath was the main token. Breath for life, but also for speech. They talked to the patient who was in the artificial coma. And they said, you know, they hear our voice and they register what we say. Immediacy is the second principle. Of course, people clapped their hands, but did they understand the new positive, they say, the new positive energy we spread out in the whole team? A quality of presence impossible to imagine outside. Suddenly, they discovered new resources, in spite of the negative discourse in the media. They discovered each other on an equal footing. For instance, the surgeons who are always up there did the work with the caregivers at a low level. And everybody was equal, no hierarchy. Nobody tried to drop out. Everybody came. In total contrast with what is said. They were all in a special time space where, while life was at stake, connected with the population, and that was also the first time. Expectancy is the third principle. Nurses wrote on notebooks for the patients what was happening between them. They did this not only to prevent the post-traumatic outcome of the coma, but for their own sake, since it gave them expectancy and hope. They said, perhaps he will survive and he will be able to read it. And if he dies, his children, his wife will be able to read it in the future. Every afternoon, the young doctors called the families who could not come to see their relatives. And they say, it did not take a second for the phone to be picked up. And we said one word, he or she is alive. And we heard again a huge breath of relief. To their total surprise, they felt a strong support instead of the usual criticism in intensive care unit. You know, it's always the fault of the doctor. Even when they announced the death, they heard, we pray for you. We understand your distress, from many people. And Jessica, one of the machine, and put the body in a bag. But what we don't know is that she and her colleague took great care of the body. The fourth principle is simplicity. No jargon like in our seminars. It is the fourth principle. It appears in simple anecdotes in which laughter raises against all odds. One of the anesthesiologists, the Jessica I mentioned, came from Guyana. And she decided she would save a young woman in a desperate, condemned situation who was coming from the Caribbean. She had the same age, the same color. She survived. As it happened also for death, all of a sudden. When she woke up, this young doctor decided to comb her hair, similar to her, which was a dirty lump over her head. And the nurses did not know how to manage. So she brought the adequate stuff from home when she was on call. And during 2 hours, she washed and untangled the hair of the patient. The room was transformed in a hairdresser parlor, and everybody in the ward laughed to see the doctor hairdresser. Also with joy when they saw the beautiful patient come smiling at them, coming out of hell. In a word, it calls a death arrear. An intense interpersonal relationship developed between themselves and with the patients as a plural body of survival. As in our own work, we create that in the transference. But as we are, they were often discouraged. Stagnation of a timeless, desperating time prevailed most often. The stench specific to the COVID, and they did not dare to speak about it until now, until when the video, and which they persisted, even mentioning it, they were smelling it, was awful. There was helplessness and anger, but again, at the same time, laughter. Like in Charlie Chaplin's slapsticks and all the comic films after First World War. I tell you the second anecdote. One day, the respirator started to ring and did not stop ringing a long time. The nurse tried to fix it with no way, without success. Then she told the patient who was in coma, look, this is completely crazy. Do something to that machine and I will pay you a drink when you are out. And of course, all the ward laughed. The machine stopped and the patient survived. Reading their testimonies, when I sent them my transcriptions in June, during the long weekend, as says Bion, in between the two waves of the pandemic, their authors, the 5 young people, were flabbergasted. Some cried, since in the meanwhile, their experience had almost vanished. Tensions came back in the ward, and the population was concerned with other things like vacation and so on. The same happened with forward psychotherapy in the aftermath of the wars, except for some analysts who had been in the first line and did not forget the Salmon Principles, although he never formulated as such, I heard. And although they don't say we apply the principles, but they are a paradigm: proximity, immediacy, expectancy, hope, and simplicity for the psychoanalysis of psychosis, extreme states. Even if, so after all, Frida from Reichmann, trained as a neurologist for brain-injured soldiers in a crowded military hospitals during First World War, like those hospitals with no resource, in Königsberg, Oriental Prussia. Ferenzi also was drafted in a military hospital in Hungary, and he learned there about a different kind of transference. Bion was a traumatized veteran of First World War. He was analyzed by first analysts who always wanted him to speak about his childhood. He called him Pip, put it in the past. And then by Rickman, who also was at war. And the master of Rickman was William Rivers. William Rivers was an anthropologist. He was not a psychoanalyst. Very famous in Cambridge, in England, neurologist, and he was drafted to work with crazy officers coming back from France and Belgium. And he invented this kind of transference, reading Freud and changing completely the technique in order to reach their silenced experience. All learned their job in desperate situations, in a spirit of love and justice. But what do these two words mean in such circumstances? Indeed, love and justice are at stake in a very specific sense. While we are in situations of lack of resource, either to face the spreading of the virus or to face delusions, traumatic revivals which defeat our theories. One of the nurses cried one day, "I am fed up with COVID." And I must say, I also am often fed up with madness. But there are still unclaimed moments of transference which we forget and which tend to silence since they reach cut out or entrenched places of ourselves, like I told you for my first experience with the doctor. I contend that love and justice occurring in such particular moments have been defined long, long ago in the context of pandemics. And I will give you two examples. It's not new. The first example derives from Plato Symposium, in which it's a dialogue in which different people or famous people meet to speak around a meal about love, each of them giving his point of view. When Socrates' turn comes to give his own conception of love, he does not take the floor. He speaks through the voice of a woman, Diotima. Who is she? She is a foreigner, a prophetess, but for our purpose, she is a medicine woman who kept at bay the plague in Athens, which was described by the historian Thucydide. I don't know how you pronounce it in English, Thucydide or something, Thucydides, and from which Pericles died at the time of Socrates. From her experience, eros, love, in extreme states is not a matter of desire for such or such people, like such person, like the other people in the banquet described. It is a matter, love is a source of life. And Diotima gives her filiation. His dad, Eros' dad, is called Poros. Poros means the passage. You can hear it in the word porosity. His mom is Peña. You hear it in penury. It means poverty. So he is the son of the passage and the poverty. This is this is at the core of the transference in extreme states. Because this porosity between the patient and the analyst links an unclaimed experience, like Cathy Carus' title, in the patient story to analogous zones, in a total lack of resource. Poverty, poverty of words, no words. Now, about justice. In such circumstances, I will quote another writer. His famous book is called The Decameron. It was written explicitly for women. He composed it during the plague, the Black Plague, which spread out where he lived in 1348, killing 100,000 people in 8 months. His introduction to his book is amazing. He describes exactly what we are going through. I quote, "Doctors don't understand anything. There are no treatments. The contagion spreads quickly. People confine themselves or flee to the country, where poor peasants are dying in the worst conditions. Funeral rites are no more respected. And what is more important, the foundation of the law stumbles, leashing delinquency, crimes, and abuses of all sorts. People abandon the sick. Parents abandon their children. Women are raped, violated, and so on. Now the question for Boccaccio is how to reestablish justice when there is no more justice, except the hand of the death, which kills equally everybody. Boccaccio imagines a psychotherapy, it's clear, in that death area, claiming justice for, especially for women, I give you the quote, who need more help than men, since they are bullied by the whims of a father, a mother, a brother, or husband. So this is what follows, the story of the Decameron. 7 young girls, aged from 18 to 28, meet by chance in a church. They are dressed all in black since their relatives are dead, and they know each other. The oldest, Pampinet is her name, scolds her companions for the sake of, quote, their fundamental right, not only but to find again their, well, in French, joie de vivre. Don't stay so lethargic, she scolds them. We can escape horrors as long as death does not strike us. It is a matter of will. End of quote. She proposes them to go to the country, but one of the girls is more realistic on the matter of rape. And by chance, and so she's prudent, she say we are at risk. But by chance, the fortune brings in the church 3 young men whom they know and who will come with them. So they all go to the country, 10 of them, in mansions that they have in the country. And they will spend a fortnight. The frame is very strict, no more than 2 weeks. And they are determined to survive psychologically. In order to restore the social link exploded by chaos, their main tool will be storytelling. A strict equality is established between them. Each of them will be king or queen for a day and take the responsibility of their schedule. Promenade in the country, meals, singing, dancing, to provide a joyful rhythm in the apnea in French, apnea of anguish, like that. The key of the psychotherapy will be, as they sit in a circle every afternoon among the blooming nature and hearing the whistling of the birds, to tell a story, each of them. So every day, 10 stories every day, during 10 days, except Sundays and Saturdays. And this will make 100 stories of the Decameron. Will inspire many authors afterward. For instance, Chaucer, who was, I don't know if he met him, but Chaucer met his best friend, poet Petrarch, and he wrote the Canterbury Tales. In the 16th century, this book was used, and there were imitations during the religion war. And until 19th century, where there were operas on some of the stories. Because in the beginning of all stories, the author writes a little story and the last story. The first story, because the first and the last draw the political perversion. In the first story, a notorious famous lawyer whose talent is to turn the law upside down and who praised himself for his crimes, makes up a forged confession on his deathbed to an old learned cleric with good intention to forgive and so on, and he fools him completely. After his death, this crooked man becomes a saint in the town. The last novella is called Griselda, very, very well known. There are operas on this subject. So it's again about a perverse attacks or persecution against her. Her husband deprives her of her children and treats her like a slave and expels her. Still, that's important. She never enters his ruthless world, never discusses what he says, never tries to understand. That is the advice given by Hannah Arendt in the Totalitarianism to face totalitarian power. Don't understand, or you are lost in it. So she stays steadfast, faithful to her disappeared children. And at the end, she wins the fight. She recovers them as they are adolescent, and she recovers her place in the household. The husband is defeated. The common interpretation of this story may reduce her to obedience and submission. But the lesson is opposite in this extreme situation. In the lawless political context, she says no to annihilation, as did the 10 youths of the Decameron. They return to Florence after the 2 weeks, not lonely as they were before, but they are part of what I call a plural body of survival, made with, woven with words and stories against mind control by murderous discourses and agencies. I also witnessed this special link in the video testimonies so close to our work. Justice here is the right for a political subject to resist destruction. Its weapon seems ridiculous compared with the amount of misery and violence around. Still, on a small scale, a ring of speech, of rhythm, of music is created, which is not denial, but resistance, which can be transmitted through generations. I give you an example. You in the United States, you know very well this ring around roses that I heard my American grandkids sing, and they all fall down. And my daughter-in-law said it was coming from the plague. So when children, the transmission, intergenerational transmission is not only of trauma, it's also of tools against death. When children are dancing and singing, they transform the horrors of the plague into words and music, which ring accurately to our ears through centuries. I read the Decameron during the pandemic, and I thought that the stories told to me by video by 5 young women and a young man working on the front lines bore the same therapeutic quality for all of us. That's why I tell them to you. They also were exasperated by the common opinion, complaining, depressing, and pulling you down. And also using the pandemic for games of power. Telling stories, that's my conclusion, is a major therapeutic tool. I will conclude on that topic. A patient whom I had met in a psychiatric ward when I worked during 30 years in a psychiatric hospital, she was Saturn, the great goddess of the earth. And she now is an expert in yoga. Well, we worked 15 years together. Expert in yoga and without any meds. And she told me, she calls me every month to keep me updated on her new life. And she told me, not long ago, you know, what was useful for me was not your theories. It were the stories that you told me about your favorite books and your own life, little bits. She's Italian, and she is the one who told me to read Boccaccio. So she teaches me now during the confinement, which I did, and I thanked her. And that was a huge breath. Thank you.